So today I'll be assessing the life of King Alfred the Great, one of the most important people in English and probably world history. So this period I'll be assessing, it's around 847 to 899, which is the life of King Alfred. Some of the sources I'm going to be using are a ecclesiastical history of the English people, which is written by a monk called Bede in the 700s. I'm also going to use the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is how I learned a lot about the events and how they transpired, and especially the English person's view on some of these events. And I'm also going to be using Astor's Life of Alfred, which is the biography of King Alfred the Great. So Anglo-Saxon history, Anglo-Saxon England is very hard to understand, or it's very difficult to understand because it happened so long ago. There aren't very many sources. Essentially, what we do know in the 5th century, a wave of immigration or possibly invasion from the mainland, where a large conglomeration of people, including the Saxons and the Angles, the Frisians, a bunch of other tribes, they conquered most of England, and they formed all these smaller petty kingdoms. Conquered from the normal Brythonic-speaking people, such as the Welsh, I guess. They formed these kingdoms called Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, some of these other smaller kingdoms, and Wessex, which is very important for understanding Anglo-Saxon history, because Wessex is probably one of the most influential kingdoms of all time. So this is the Old English language. It sounds very different from modern-day English, and it's very interesting and very unique language. It's mostly German.
Feder ure, thu art on heovonum, si nama yihagod.
So that's a bit of what we're kind of dealing with here. Very interesting language, very different language from the modern day. But it changed essentially when the Vikings attacked. So the family of King Alfred the Great, he is the son of King Aethelwulf of Wessex, who's the son of Egbert of Wessex. He had 3 or possibly 4 older brothers. We're not sure if this one is a brother or a uncle. And he actually never should have been king, if you think about it. All these men, they reached adulthood, and this one even had several sons. However, very different circumstances caused the normal line of succession to be kind of overthrown. As you can see, these people have very short reigns. That was the result of the Viking Age. This was a period from about 793 to about 1066. It's kind of started with the Viking raid of Lindisfarne, where a large number of Danish Vikings sacked a Northumbrian monastery. And this was very significant at the time. No one could have think this would happen. This was kind of like 9/11 for these people. And it was very apocalyptic what they saw. But life remained fairly ordinary. There'd be constant raids and small incursions into Vikings, but that was until a massive event. It was called the Great Heathen Army. The Vikings are essentially a group of people from this area of the world, from Sweden, Norway, essentially I think most Vikings that attacked England were from Denmark, so they would be called Danes. It's inaccurate to call them Vikings, as Viking is essentially an action. It's like saying I went on a Viking. They would essentially be called Vikingers, at least by the Old English. It's very hard to understand what the Vikings thought of themselves, as they didn't really have a written language. They had runes, but it's not very similar, or it doesn't convey as much meaning as modern written languages would. So, as I said, in 865, the Great Heathen Army touched down, and this was the result of King Aella of Northumbria, allegedly, according to myth, executing Ragnar Lothbrok, who was the father of a great Viking warlord named Ivar the Boneless, and as well as several other Viking sea kings. And essentially, it was a massive horde, or maybe around a few hundred to a few thousand, because that's what they considered massive at the time. It touched down East Anglia. They made an alliance with the king, but they eventually killed him anyway. Then they marched up to Northumbria, where they gave King Aella the Blood Eagle, where they essentially ripped his lungs out his back. It's not a very pleasant story. And they conquered all of England until they finally invaded Wessex, because this was unlike anything they ever counted for. This is sort of like colonialism more than just normal raids. This is kind of English are getting colonized for once. Very interesting scenario. So there were plenty of battles between Alfred the Great. His brother Aethelred, who was the king at the time, eventually dies, probably in a battle with Vikings. And so these were very bloody battles. We know they targeted plenty of civilians. They killed lots of monks, enslaved lots of people. They weren't all bad. The Vikings are essentially very misunderstood group of people. They were very clean. They were very civilized. You almost certainly don't have any good view on what the Vikings are, but it was a very certainly a very bloody timeline. But after all these battles, eventually, after Alfred eventually is dethroned by the Vikings, and it kind of looks like they had actually won, and England was about to turn to some sort of Scandinavian neo-pagan or pagan state. Eventually, he musters enough power after being dethroned by the Vikings, and he overtakes them in the Battle of Edington, where the leader of the Vikings, called Guthrum, he actually had to be baptized, and the Vikings had to retreat from England. They formed a state called the Danelaw. As you can see, it's very important here because the English actually gained territory. They didn't lose territory, especially Wessex gained territory. So Wessex has become a massive power at this time. They had puppet kings in all these areas. They were a very strong military force, and at this point, Vikings were actually becoming a lot less of a problem, partially due to Alfred himself, at least during his lifetime, because the Viking Age was not done after his life, and his heirs would fare far worse than he did against the Vikings. So in Alfred's reign, one of the most important thing he did was he reformed the military of Anglo-Saxon England. He formed all these towns in the Burgle Hedge, these are essentially they're called burhs, which are essentially small fortified buildings which allow English people to hide in and defend themselves against Vikings. He trained a lot of his people. They're called feared. They're sort of like a militia or what you consider a national guard at this time. Um, as you can see, there's it's a very ancient way of fighting. They wouldn't really be using swords; they'd be using spears, axes, very rudimentary items. As England had been very depopulated at this time. In fact, Alfred's biography constantly references how he lost battles due to so few living men remaining in England that it's actually having a serious effect on the ability for Alfred to actually wage war and protect his kingdom. So, also something he did was very important. He During the Viking raids into England, they destroyed plenty of monasteries, and monasteries were places of learning at this time. Um, uh, they were the monks gathering where people could actually learn. People would learn to, I guess, read and write if they wanted to. Uh, and At this time in English history, very few people knew how to read. Very few people were educated. Not even most nobles probably couldn't read. Most aldermen of Alfred, and that's something he really wanted to change. In fact, he started a bunch of started a bunch of schools, and in something a very important line I heard from one of his books was he's discussing a school that he built for his son, and it included children quote of a good many of lesser birth, and I believe it even included girls at some point. So it's somewhat almost a sort of progressive modern education system that would actually be fair to everyone. He also reformed the laws. He wrote them in his own writing, especially related to the Dane law, and he sort of created a sort of uneasy truth with the Danes. And with He also formed a navy himself. Saw as kind of the prototype to the English navy. Uh, it essentially protected England, and he himself managed to defend England itself. You can kind of tell because all these names they sort of remained English even after Vikings invaded. Vikings invaded. The names north of in the Danelaw have noticeably different Scandinavian names. In the north of England, you could even notice some cultural differences between southern England and northern England. So it's really difficult to say how much this one man changed modern history. For starters, he essentially protected all of England from collapse. If he died when he was throned, for all we know, English culture could have been wiped from the earth. You could be speaking some entirely different language today. You're speaking some weird Danish amalgamation. For all we know, the Norman conquest may not have happened. English history was altered forever. As a result, world history would be altered forever. All of these areas that are light in blue that speak English, for all we know, they might not speak the same language. They might not practice the same religion. They might be sort of pagan. And it's really difficult to say how much is changing. This is this grandson of Alfred. It's starting to say that if he hadn't been the Vikings did overthrow them at some points, but they eventually got them back. But if the House of Wessex, the royal dynasty, hadn't been instituted at the time, it's really difficult to say how English history would have evolved. It certainly would have evolved differently from today. And it's almost impossible to imagine how different modern life would be without King Alfred the Great.